يا مرحب، سوري اضطريت وقف الفيديو التاني. هل سامعيني هلا؟ هون رجعت عملت فيديو تاني. اذا سامعيني بس ارجعوا اعملوا لي كومنت سامعيني وشايفيني، لانه وقفوك كنت عم بنقل شوي من مباراة كرة القدم، ما كنت عارف رح يتم حظري. هل سامعيني؟ وي، شايفني او سامعني؟ بس فيك تاكد لي، فيك تجاوبني. ما كنت عارف. اهلا وسهلا فيكم. ما كنت عارف انه نقل الورلد كاب رح يعمل لي حظر. عملوا لي حظر، بس ايه، كله منيح كله منيح جود. ما رح اقدر انقلها، شكلهم رح يمنعوني انقلها، بس رح نطلع على النتائج. خل كنت عم بتنقل بين كرة القدم، الورلد كاب، مع مباراة المغرب وفرنسا والاف او ام سي. الاف او ام سي رح يتم بعد 13 دقيقة، خلينا ننطره ليبلش لنشوف على هالاساس شو رح يصير. آه، هايدي النتيجة على الطرف. جود جود. هلا انا زيادة الفوائد 0.5% كان متوقع. اجين ما بعتقد هالشي كان انه هالشي المخيف. 0.5% هذا هو المتوقع. كلمة باول، أنا عملت تويت عن الموضوع. كلمة باول هي اللي رح تأثر على السوق بشكل كتير قوي. إذا بده يحكينا عنه الارتفاعات المستقبلية رح تكمل، هذا الشيء رح يكون سلبي. اذا بده يقلنا شو بده يجي على المستقبل، هالاشياء كلها اللي رح ياثر اكثر من الزياده، لانه الزياده كانت متوقعه 0.5% تكون. خلينا نشوف. يلا يبلش يحكوا بقى. هو لازم يكون على الساعة 2 بتوقيت أمريكا، صار 2 ونص. زادوا الوقت. هلا بدنا ننطر بعد 10 دقايق وبنشوف شو عم بيصير. حكيت عن هالموضوع. هلا ناطرين بس كلمة باول لنشوف كيف بده يكون، إذا سياسة التشدد رح تكمل ولا لا. انا عارف ممل، كنا حاطين ماتش المغرب وبس وقفوا لنا الفيديو. النطرة 10 دقايق مملة أكيد. كنت حاطط ما ماتش المغرب، وقفوا لنا الفيديو، اضطريت أرجع فوت، ما فيني أرجع أحطه. عملوا لنا حظر. السؤال، أنا جاوبتك. الحكاية الحل يا خالد، إذا بدك تنقل عملاتك على على محافظ باردة، إذا كانوا كلهم على الإيثيريوم أكيد بكلفوا أموال، ولكن فيك تعمل لهم تحويل على غير شبكات، مثلا على ماتيك، على حيلا شبكة تانية. يعني في كتير شبكات، بوليجون، بوكا دوت، غير حيلا شبكة غير. انا اكتريتهم استعملتهم على الماتيك، حولتهم من خلال الماتيك، هيك وفرت كتير اموال. فينا نشوف تشارت بهالمجال. عم نطلع على خلينا عم قلل الوقت، لانه عم حطها على 15 دقيقة. انا عادة ما بطلع على هيك، بس لانه هلا في حدث بتطلع انا على النهار، واكثر بتطلع على المجالات البعيدة بالتشارتس. ولكن هلا لانه في حدث، اذا كان خطابه متشدد اكيد معقول يهبط السوق، هذا شيء مؤكد. آه، ماذا إذا اشتريت مباشرة على محفظة تراست والت سواب، عندهم الفيز والرسوم أكثر من المنصات ولا نفسها؟ انا عاده ما بشتري خلال التراست من المنصه هي ذاتها. انا بفوت على تمويل لا مركزي مثل ديفاي ايكو سيستم بقلب تراست وولت او بقلب الميتا ماسك او بقلب حيالله شيء، وبشتري من هونيك قبل ما احول. هونيك بستعمل على البي ام بي اللي هي رخيصه النتورك فيس تبعها. عندك طريقة لحل مشكلة الشراء من موقع ليدجر؟ ما قبلوا البطاقة تبعي والبنك قال رفضوا أي معاملة. المشكلة من عندهم أظن. أما أنا ما بشتري على الليدجر، أنا بشتري على المنصة وببعت على الليدجر، أوفر بكتير صراحة. يعني شخصيا هيك بعمل، بس ما بعرف بركي إذا في شيء حظر من البلد اللي أنت فيه. ما بعرف الوضع هي ماشي بأكترية البلدان. يب. بعد 10 دقايق على بعد 8 دقايق من هلا الاف او ام سي. الهدف الوصول إلى 5 فائدة. بدهم يوصلوا الفائدة والتضخم يكونوا نفس الرقم لحتى يقدروا يغطوا عن بعضهم. ساعتها بيوصل للتضخم لمراحل هن بدهم إياها. يعني بدهم التضخم ينزل، عادة هيك بيصير بوقت صعود التضخم لدرجة كبيرة، بيعلوا الفائدة لنفس المجالات، وهيك بيبين. آه، ان شاء الله المغرب برضه يكون تخفيف للفيدرالي. ان شاء الله تكون السياسه الفيدرالي، واكيد ان شاء الله المغرب تربح. ما راح يهبط السوق. قصدك بدك تشتري ليدجر؟ آه لازم في عندي روابط تحت فيك تفوت تشتري فيهم، الا وعم بيودوا على كل البلدان على حد علمي. ما بعرف اذا الا اذا في مجال بلدان تانيين. مين المطورين لعملة كادينا؟ ما بعرف عالم عم يشتغلوا على كادينا ليطوروا تطبيقات، بس بعرف الأصحاب يعني سامع عنهم، ما بعرفهم شخصيا. العالم اللي هن عملوا كادينا كانوا في أحدهم كان يشتغل بسوني، أحدهم كان يشتغل، يعني عالم في رؤوس أموال وراهم وعالم أذكياء. ايش معقول بس 4 لايك؟ والله حرام. ايه انا معه، اذا فيكم تعملوا لي لايك بكون ممنونكم. لايك وسبسكرايب بكون اكثر من ممنونكم انا. رفع الفائدة 0.5%. تم رفع الفائدة، وأنا عملت عليها تويت. 0.5% تم رفع الفائدة. شكرا كريم. لحظة بس عم نطلع على شو عم بيصير هون. بعدهم 1-0. يلا بقى. لحظة بس عم بتطلع على شغلة. أنا نحن منتظرين. هلا بنكون. عفوا خلينا نرجع على الأسئلة تبعكم. سوري عفوا كنت عم بطلع على شيء. كاسبا عاملة بروف اوف ورك، عندها داج خاص فيها عم بتشتغل عليه. بدنا نشوف التطوير عليها، بس في منا كثير على اكسشينج، ما في تداول كبير فيها يعني، ما منا هيك. احلى لايك، بشكرك خيي، تستاهل كل خير. خلي اياك عبد الله، نحن دائما حط لك اكثر من لايك كنت رح احط لك خلي لي اياك. الاعصاب تلفاني والله. اخي هذا البير ماركت، بس هذا افضل وقت الواحد يركز. هلا ما فينا نمل ونظهر من السوق. هلا العالم اللي عملت اموال بالكريبتو هي عملتها اللي اشتريوا بالبير ماركت، وقت كانت الاسواق هابطه كتير، العالم خيفانه، والاعصاب تلفانه بالعالم اللي مشبرح، هن اكثر عالم استفادوا بالكريبتو. لازم يسد الشات. والله لايك، انا بتمنى عليكم تعملوا لايك، بس انا هون لساعد المجتمع، مش لاخذ لايكات وفيوز وهيك. انا لساعد المجتمع، بس بتمنى عليكم تعملوا لايك. اكيد بيساعد بالقناه انه تبين اكثر عند غير عالم. اذا فيكم تعملوا لايك شير او تعملوا سبسكرايب، هالشيء بيساعدني كتير اكيد. لو ما كسبت المغرب رح اعمل لك ديسلايك وريبورت. يا اخي انا شو خصني انا شو انا عم بلعب. يلا بس ان شاء الله تربح، هيدا ان شاء الله. هسه السوق حيصعد او حينزل حسب كلام باول، ناطرين كلنا كلمة باول. هذا بعد فيه دقيقتين وبتبلش المؤتمر. وان شاء الله خير. بس لهلا شكل السوق هابط، بس كمان بيتم تلاعب كتير قبل ما يتحدث. ايه ما تاخر، هو لازم تكون على الساعه 2 بس تاخرها ل 2 ونص، تاخروا المؤتمر. هذا انا حاطط على المؤتمر، هذا الصوت اللي عم تسمعوه من المؤتمر انتم هون. يا بعرف انا بتاع هربت منه. احلى انه اول فيديو عملته طلع، عملوا لي ريبورت. ما انا بلشت فيديو وعملوا لي ريبورت، هلا بلشت بالواحد بفيديو تاني كرمال ما اظهر. يا كم شهر بس. هي الركود الاقتصادي هذا اللي حكينا عنه، زيادة الفوائد رح تؤدي للركود. بعد ما شفناها 100%، السنة الجاي رح نشوفها. وانا حاكي عن الموضوع كذا كذا مرة. الركود زيادة التضخم بلش ينزل، ولكن زيادة الفوائد على فترة طويلة رح تؤدي للركود اللي رح نبلش نشوفه السنة اللي جاي. أستاذ بدوي مع حسن حيدر من لبنان، ما هي أفضل منصة تتداول الذهب والنفط؟ في كذا منصة، بس أفضل وحدة ما فيني أقول لك. أنا يعني بشتري خلال اي تي افس هون بأستراليا، غير يعني شوي عن لبنان. بس هلا بشوف لك كم وحدة صراحة. بعرف ايتورو بيعمل هالأمور، ولكن ايتورو مؤسسينه في عليهم علامات استفهام شوي صراحة. عملت هوك ما بعرفها صراحة. هلا ما رح اقدر فوت اطلع عليها لانه ناطرين الفيدرالية اي دقيقة بلش. يلا خلينا نكبر الصورة. يلا قربنا قرب. ان شاء الله خير، ان شاء الله يكون خير. اجا. بدك يكون وجه ام ولا وجه خير اليوم علينا؟ لا نقله كذا مرة. الصوت مش طالع؟ لحظة خلّيني أشوف. لحظة بس عم جرّب ضبّط الصوت. عم بيقول بده يكفّي بسياسة التشدُّد وهدفه يهبّط لدرجات هو المقبولة عنده. بس خلّيني أشوف ليه ما بس رح أجرّب ضبّطها. لحظة بس إيه عم باعرف ما في صوت، عم جرّب ضبّط الأمر. رح أظهر شوي وأرجع أدخل أنا.
In November, the 12-month change in the CPI was 7.1%, and the change in the core CPI was 6%.
صرتوا عم تسمعوا الصوت هلأ؟
So far for October and November,
بس قولوا لي إذا إيه والّا لأ إذا عم
in the
تسمعوا
monthly
الصوت.
pace of price increases. But it will take substantially more evidence to give confidence that inflation is on a sustained downward path.
Okay.
Price pressures remain evident across a broad range of goods and services. Russia's war against Ukraine has boosted prices for energy and food and has contributed to upward pressure on inflation.
عم بيقولوا التضخم
The
تأثّر
median projection in the
بأوكرانيا
SEP for
والحرب
total
وزادت الأسعار.
PCE inflation is 5.6% this year and falls to 3.1% next year, 2.5% in 2024, and 2.1% in 2025.
هدفه بال 2024 2021 يوصل ل 2%
as
تقريبا.
weighted to the upside. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. But that is not grounds for complacency. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become entrenched.
Okay.
The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people.
هو هدفه يثبت الأسعار ويأمن الوظائف للشعب الأمريكي. بس بعده عين
التضخم. Especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation.
بدنا يسيطروا عليه وخاصة بالأكل التنقلات أسعار التنقلات وهالأمور.
And we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective.
هدفهم يوصلوا ل 2%
At
تضخم.
today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by a half percentage point,
هلا زادوه ب
bringing the target range to
0.5%.
4.25% to 4.5%.
وصلت ل
And we are continuing the
0.4%
process of
فوائد.
significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. With today's action, we have raised interest rates by 4.25 percentage points this year. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate
رح
in order
يضلوا
to seek
يكملوا
to attain a
زيادات.
stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2%
رح يضلوا
over
يزيدوا
time.
الفوائد هالشيء.
Over the course of the year, financial conditions have tightened significantly. It is important that over time they reflect
اوكي هذا الشيء رح يهبط الاسواق لانه هو قال بده يكفي زياده
the
الفوائد.
policy restraint that we're putting in place.
هالكلمه اللي قالها
return
هلا
inflation
سيئه
to 2%.
للاسواق صراحه.
We are seeing the effects on demand in the most interest-sensitive sectors of the economy, such as housing. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, the committee decided to raise interest rates by 50 basis points today, a step down from the 75 basis point pace seen over the previous 4 meetings. Of
خففوا
course, 50
زياده
basis points is still a historically large increase, and we
خففوا
still
زياده
have some
الفوائد
ways to go.
وبس
As shown in
ولكن
the
رح
SEP,
يكفوا
the median
بالزيادات.
projection for the appropriate level of the federal funds rate is 5.1% at the end of next year, a half percentage point higher than projected in September. The median projection is 4.1% at the end of 2024 and 3.1% at the end of 2025, still above the median estimate of its longer run value.
عم بيشوفوا عم بيقولوا هو شو هدفهم بالمستقبل وين بدهم يوصلوا ل 2024 2025 بالزيادات.
And no one knows with any certainty where the economy will be a year or more from now.
ما حدا بيعرف وين رح يكون الاقتصاد من هلا
Our decisions
لسنه.
will depend on the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation.
قراراتهم
And
بتعتمد
we will
على
continue to make our
شو عم بيصير
decisions meeting by
بالاقتصاد
meeting and communicate our
والمعلومات اللي
thinking
عندهم
as
اياها.
clearly as possible.
رح يحكوا
We're
مع
taking
العالم
forceful
بطريقه
steps to
اوضح
moderate
طرق.
demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored.
هدفه يضل
Reducing
مسيطر
inflation
على
is likely to
التضخم. هذا
require a
هدف.
sustained period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices
لنثبت
over the
الاسعار
long
هذا
run.
شيء كتير ضروري مهم بالنسبه
The
له
historical record cautions
لحتى
strongly
يضلوا
against
الوظائف
prematurely
ويضل
loosening
الاقتصاد قوي.
policy. We will stay the course until the job is done.
رح يضلوا بالطريق ذاته لحتى
To conclude, we
يزبط
understand that our
الهدف.
actions
يعني
affect
رح يضلوا
communities,
يزيد الفوائد.
families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission.
كل شيء بيعمله هو
We at the
للشعب
Fed will do
ولهدفهم.
everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability
رح
goals.
يعملوا كل شيء بيقدروا عليه
Thank you. I will look
ليوصلوا.
forward to your questions.
هلا الاسئله هلا بدنا نشوف.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Thanks for taking my question, Mr. Chairman. You just talked about the importance of market conditions reflecting the policy restraint you put in place. Since the November meeting, the 10-year has declined by 60 basis points. Mortgage rates have come down. High-yield credit spreads have come in. The economy is accelerated, and the stock market's up 6%. Is this loosening of financial conditions a problem for the Fed in its effort and its fight against inflation? And if so, do you need to do something about that? And how would you do something about that? Thank you.
So as I mentioned, it is important that overall financial conditions continue to reflect the policy restraint that we're putting in place to bring inflation down to 2%.
هدفه يوصل ل 2%. ما بعتقد بقى منطقي يوصل ل 2%.
But our policy actions work through financial conditions, and those in turn affect economic activity, the labor market, and inflation. So what we control is our policy moves and the communications that we make. Financial conditions both anticipate and react to our actions. Okay. I would add that our focus is not on short-term moves, but on persistent moves.
هدفه ما يطلع على المدى القصير، بده يطلع على المدى البعيد.
I would say it's our judgment today that we're not at a sufficiently restrictive policy stance yet, which is why we say that we would expect that ongoing hikes would be appropriate. And I would point you to
هن
the
متوقع
S&P again
تكملة
for
زيادات الفوائد
our
بالمستقبل.
current estimate of what that peak level will be. As you will have seen, 19 people filled out the SEP this time, and 17 of those 19 wrote down a peak rate of 5% or more, in the fives. So that's our best assessment today for what we think the peak rate will be. You will also know that at each subsequent SEP during the course of this year, we've actually increased our estimate of what that peak rate will be. And today, the SEP that we're published shows again that overwhelmingly FOMC participants believe that inflation risks are to the upside. So I can't tell you confidently that we won't move up our estimate of the peak rate again at the next SEP. I don't know what we'll do. It will depend on future data. What we're writing down today is our best estimate of what we think that peak rate will be based on what we know.
هو عم يعطي تقدير شو بده يصير زيادة الفوائد على التقدير، بس إذا تغيرت المعطيات بيغير هو بالوضع.
Gina Smilik, New York Times. Thanks for taking our questions.
New York Times.
The SEP, like you mentioned, suggests that the Fed will be making another 3/4 percentage points worth of rate increases in 2023. I wonder if you would foresee that being in 25 basis point increments, 50 basis point increments, sort of how you see this.
عم تسألوا بكفي زيادات 50% 0.5% 0.75 ولا 0.25% بالمستقبل؟ كيف الزيادات رح تكون؟ هيك سؤال مهم.
So, as I've been saying, as we've gone through the course of this year, as we lifted off and got into the course of the year, and we saw how strong inflation was and how persistent, it was very important to move quickly. In fact, the speed, the pace with which we were moving was the most important thing. We're into now that we're coming to the end of this year, we've raised 425 basis points this year, and we're into restrictive territory. It's now not so important how fast we go. It's far more important to think, what is the ultimate level? And then at a certain point, the question will become, how long do we remain restrictive? That will become the most important question. But I would say the most important question now is no longer the speed. So, and that applies to February as well. So I think we'll make the February decision based on the incoming data and where we see financial conditions, where we see
ما في يعطي الجواب هلا، بده ينطر لشهر شباط، لأنه الاجتماع الثاني بشهر شباط، وحسب المعطيات وأرقام التضخم والأمور اللي عم تطلع بيعمل قراراته على هالأساس.
And making an assessment of whether policy is restrictive enough. I've told you today we have an assessment that we're not at a restrictive enough stance, even with today's move, and we've laid out our individual assessments of what we would need to do to get there. At a certain point, though, that what we would need to do to get there. Point, and then at a certain point, though, that we'll get to that inflation is coming down in a sustained way, and we think that will be some time. Now, why do I say that? If you look at you can break inflation down into three sort of buckets. The first is goods inflation, and we see now, as we've been expecting really for a year and a half, that supply conditions would get better, and ultimately supply chains get fixed, and demand settles down a little bit, and maybe goes back to services a little bit, and we start to see goods inflation coming down. We're now starting to see that in this report. Then you go to housing services. We know the story there is that housing services inflation has been very, very high, and will continue to go up actually as rents expire and have to be renewed. They're going to be renewed into a market where rates are higher than they were when the original leases were signed. But we see that the new leases that the rate for new leases is coming down. So once we work our way through that backlog, that inflation will come down sometime next year. The third piece, which is something like 55% of the index, PCE core inflation index, is non-housing related core services. And that's really a function of the labor market largely. It's the biggest cost by far in that sector is labor. And we do see a very, very strong labor market. One where we haven't seen much softening, where job growth is very high, where wages are very high, vacancies are quite elevated, and really there's an imbalance in the labor market between supply and demand. So that part of it, which is the biggest part, is likely to take a substantial period to get
وهذا
down.
الشيء رح يكون على المدى البعيد رح يفوتنا بركود اقتصادي لنا
after
ولا
not
لا
turning at all for a
هذا
year and a
الامر
half.
رح
Now it
يصير.
seems to be turning, but there's an expectation really that the services inflation will not move down so quickly, so that we'll have to stay at it, so that we may have to raise rates higher to get to where we want to go. And that's really why we are writing down those high rates and why we're expecting that they'll have to remain high for a time.
إذا كان في صعود رح يكون مؤقت يعني عم لكم.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thanks for taking the question. You described GDP growth in the SEPs as moderate or modest, I believe. Yet it's really approaching stall speed. Half a percentage point is not much. You described labor market unemployment rate as representing some softening, but it's nearly a full percentage point rise, and that's well in excess of what has historically been associated with recession. Why wouldn't this be considered a recessionary projection by the Fed?
ليش ما عم تقول نحن بركود اقتصادي مع انه كل شيء عم بيخف؟
I'll tell you what the projection is. I don't think it would qualify as a recession, no, because you've got positive growth. The expectations in the SEP are basically,
لانه في
as you
عندنا
said, which is
نمو بامور معينه
at a modest level, which is to say about a half a percentage point. That's positive growth. It's slow growth. It's well below trend. It's not going to feel like a boom. It's going to feel like very slow growth.
الركود رح يبين بعدين. حاليا هن منهم بركود ولكن علامات مؤشرات الركود هي متأخرة. البطالة رح تبلش تزيد الجاي والشركات الكبيرة اللي ما عم توظف بقى. كل هالأمور
those forecasts of inflation are really much above the natural rate of unemployment. We can never identify its location with great precision. But that 4.7% is still a strong labor market. If you look, you've got the reports we get from the field are that companies are very reluctant to lay people off, other than the tech companies, which is a story unto itself. Generally, companies want to hold on to the workers they have because it's been very, very hard to hire. So, and you've got all these vacancies out there far in excess of the number of employed people. That doesn't sound like a labor market where a lot of people will need to be put out of work. So that there are channels through which the labor market can come back into balance with relatively modest increases in unemployment, we believe. None of that is guaranteed, but that is what their forecast reflects.
Nick.
Thanks, Nick Temeros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, I want to follow up on Gina's question. The decision to step down the pace of rate rises appears to have been socialized at your last meeting, largely before the past two CPI reports showed inflation decelerating in line with the committee's forecast this year. You just now talked about making decisions meeting by meeting and being mindful of the lags of policy. Does that mean all things equal, you would feel more comfortable probing where the terminal rate is by moving in 25 basis point increments, including beginning at your next meeting?
So I haven't made a judgment on
عم يسألوا إذا معقول
what size
تبلش
rate
تزيد
hike
ب
to make at the last
6.25%.
But
قال له ما
what
قررت
you
بعد.
said is broadly right, which is having moved so quickly and having now so much restraint that's still in the pipeline, we think that the appropriate thing to do now is to move to a slower pace. And that will allow us to feel our way and and get to that level, we think, and better balance the risks that we face.
عم بقول هو لانه مشيوا بسرعه وبقوه لهم فتره هلا اذا بلش يهبط الاسواق تهبط الاسواق شوي بلشنا نقرب على الركود افضل نخفض الزيادات يعني ل 50 نقطه ولا 5.25% هيك لحتى الاقتصاد ما يتاثر كثير بس رح يضلوا يزيد. هيدي الفكره.
Some of those forecasts in today's SEP?
No, absolutely not. No, as just a matter of practice, the SEP reflects any data that comes out during the meeting, and participants know that that they can make changes to their SEP during the meeting, well in advance of the press conference, so that we're not running around. But that's not the case. It's never the case that SEPs don't reflect an important piece of data that came in on the first day of the meeting.
Thanks. Rachel?
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thank you for taking our questions. I'm wondering if we could talk about the projection for the unemployment rate. Why has the Fed raised its unemployment projection? Is it because the model suggests that a higher terminal rate would automatically cause a higher unemployment rate? Or are you seeing signs that the labor market isn't quite as strong as we think it is now? Thanks.
No, it's not about the strength of the labor market. The labor market is clearly very strong. It is more just that, by now we've continually expected to make faster progress on inflation than we have ultimately. And that's why the peak rate for this year goes up between this meeting and the September meeting. You see that
عم يحكوا عن البطالة
less progress than expected on inflation.
شو
So
تأثير
that's
على
why that
الأسواق؟
goes up. And that's why unemployment goes up, because we're having to tighten policy more. And so it didn't go up by much in the meeting, I don't think, but that's the idea, is slower progress on inflation, tighter policy, probably higher rates, probably held for longer, just to get to where the kind of restriction that you need to get inflation down to 2%.
Do you have a sense of, in order to get to that number, how much of that could be caused by layoffs versus vacancies trimming or changes to the labor force population?
عم يحكوا عن أسواق الوظائف وتأثير علوا التقديرات اللي عندهم إياها على الوظائف. قالوا حسب المعطيات عم نعمل قرارات على أساس.
than what you see written down there. But why do we think that is the case? So I'll give you a few reasons. First, just is that there's this huge overhang of vacancies, meaning that vacancies can come down a fair amount, and we're hearing from many companies that they don't want to lay people off, so that they'll keep people because it's been so hard. I mean, I think it feels like we have a structural labor shortage out there, where there are 4 million fewer people, more than 4 million who are in the workforce available to work than there's demand for work. So the fact that there's a strong labor market, means that companies will hold on to workers, and it means that it may take longer, but it also means that the costs in unemployment may be less. Again, that we're going to find out empirically, but I think that's a reason.
السوق نزل يا أخي لأنه كانوا متوقعين يقول إنه بده يوقف زيادة الفوائد قريبا أو يزيدها بس بمرة واحدة بعد السنة الجاي، بس هو ما قال هالأمر. كان كل العالم متحفظين وعم بيقولوا هالأمر.
Thank you. Colby Smith with the Financial Times.
بلا تم رفع
How should
الفائدة
we interpret the
6.5%.
higher core inflation forecast for 2023 in the SEP? Does that not then suggest that the policy rate currently forecasted for next year should actually be higher than the 5.1 medium estimate penciled in?
Well, I think that's why one of the reasons it went up
0.5%
this year, came in stronger this year. Yeah, what you see is our best estimate as of today, really. As of today,
تقديراتهم حسب اليوم
to raise rates, to how much we need to tighten policy to create enough restrictive policy to slow economic activity and soften the labor market and bring inflation down through those channels. That's all that is the estimate, best estimate we make today. And as I mentioned, we'll make another estimate for the next.
هذه بحسب تقديراتهم، وهن حسب التقديرات كل مرة رح يزيدوا الفوائد على هالأساس.
Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. I wanted to make sure I understand specifically what's going on in the SEP, because you all expect rates to go higher, but you're also more pessimistic about what inflation is going to look like next year. And I was just wondering, given that we have seen some cooling in inflation, is that primarily because of wage growth, that you expect wage growth to be sort of a headwind?
No, we're going into next year with higher inflation than we had thought. Right, so
فايتين على السنة الجاي بتضخم أعلى من هن كانوا بدهم إياه. كان هن عندهم هدف معين بدهم يوصلوا له قبل ما وهلا هن بأكثر، لذلك بده يكمل بزيادة زيادة الفوائد، ومتوقع كمان المعاشات تزيد، هالشيء رح يزيد التضخم كمان.
It's just starting from a higher level at the end of 2022. So we're getting down. I believe the median is 3.5%. That's a pretty significant drop in inflation. And where's it coming from? It's coming from the goods sector, clearly. By the middle of next year, we should begin to see lower inflation.
المفروض يكون خبر إيجابي عماد، ولكن متوقع، والحديث تبعه قال بتكمل زيادة الفوائد. هالشيء أدى للسلبية، بس كمان في تلاعب شوي.
Non-housing services sector, and that's where you need to see. We believe you need to see
نفس الشيء بيقولوا كل مرة باول تقريبا بيجرب يهرب من الأجوبة.
It's not that we don't want wage increases. We want
بالنص الثاني من سنة الجاي. أي متى بتوقع بداية البول ماركت أو شيء تحول من يعني من نص سنة الجاي وبطلوع بنكون قربنا على البيتكوين هافينج وهيدا الشيء هيك يعني بتوقع. عن جد بس 10 لايكات، ما بعرف قد ايه عندي لايكات بس اذا 10 يعني بتمنى عليكم تعملوا لي لايكات يا شباب.
Some of your colleagues have been pretty explicit that they can't imagine rate cuts happening in 2023. That's certainly not implied by the SEP. But futures markets have priced in some easing in the back half of next year. What's your view of the likelihood of any kind of rate cuts next year? What circumstances might make that
إذا بتعملوا لي لايكاتكم ممنونكم.
Our focus right now is really on moving our policy stance to one that is restrictive enough to assure a return of inflation to our 2% goal over time. It's not on rate cuts. And we think that we'll have to maintain a restrictive stance of policy for some time. Historical experience cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. I guess I would say it this way. I wouldn't see us considering rate cuts until the committee is confident that inflation is moving down to 2% in a sustained way. So that's the test I would articulate. And you're correct. There are not rate cuts in
عم بتعدل لي. شكرا دكتوري. مساء الخير للجميع.
Steve Matthews with Bloomberg. Let me ask you about China. In the last few weeks, China has abandoned its COVID policy and been reopening pretty strongly. I'm wondering if you see that as disinflationary
مشكور سعد بشكرك على السوبر شات.
improve or inflationary because it obviously brings a lot more demand globally, improves the global outlook for growth and for commodities prices.
And so you're right. Those two things will offset each other. Weaker output in China will push down on commodity prices, but it could interfere with supply chains ultimately, and that could push inflation up in the West. It's very hard to say, how those two will offset each other. And it doesn't seem likely actually that the overall net effect would be material on us. But to your point, China faces a very challenging situation in reopening. And we've seen
عندها مشاكل كبيرة من ناحية إعادة فتح الاقتصاد تبعها بعد الكورونا وكل هالأمور. وهالشيء عم يساهم بالتضخم.
China faces a reopening. They've backed away from their COVID restriction policies. There could be very significant increases in COVID, and we'll just have to see. It's a risky situation. But again, it doesn't seem like it's
سعد جازم عن جد بشكرك على السوبر شات. مين بعد في 108 لايك.
Chris Gabbard, Associated Press. Thank you for taking my question. I wondered if you could comment a bit more about yesterday's inflation report. I mean, it showed inflation cooling in all three of the categories that you laid out at Brookings. Are you confident that you're seeing real progress on getting inflation under control? Are you still worried it could slip into some kind of unentrenched, upward spiral? Thank you.
Right. So the data that we've received so far for October and November, we don't have we have some remaining data to get in November, but they clearly do show a welcome reduction in the monthly pace of price increases.
عم بيقول الأرقام عم تفرجينا هبوط بأرقام التضخم وزيادة الأسعار اللي عم نشوفها.
Inflation is on a sustained downward path. So the way we think about this is this. This report is very much in line with what we've been expecting and hoping for. And what it does is it provides greater confidence in our forecast of declining inflation. As I mentioned, we've been forecasting significant declines in overall inflation and core inflation in the coming year. And this is the kind of reading that it will take to support that. So really, this gives us greater confidence in our forecast rather than at this point changing our forecast.
هن على ثقة أكبر بالتوقعات اللي عندهم إياها. متوقعين التضخم ينزل أكثر بس بعده عالي بالنسبة هن وين بدهم إياه يكون. كيفك كيف إن شاء الله راح الكورونا راح تكتب خير الله.
Around the middle of next year, so that should help. And the big piece again is core services, which is very important. And we have a ways to go there. You do see some beginning signs there, but ultimately that's that more than half, as I mentioned, of PCE core index, and it's very fundamentally about the labor market and wages. If you look at wages, look at the average hourly earnings number we got with the last payrolls report. You don't really see much progress in terms of our average hourly earnings coming down. Now there may be composition effects and other effects in that, so we don't put too much weight on any one report. These things can be volatile month to month, but we'll be looking for wages moving, down to more normal levels where
ضلك بالسوق ضلك راقب واذا فيك تعزز حسب وضعك اكيد هيدا افضل شيء. ما فيك تترك السوق. هلا افضل وقت تكون بالسوق تكون عم بتراقب. اكيد في اعصاب بس صعبه بس.
Excuse me, Michael McKee from Bloomberg Radio and Television. There's a little bit of a disconnect between the optimistic view you just expressed about the economy and the changes that you've made in the SEP. And I'm wondering if you're reacting to the fact that the markets have loosened financial conditions, or if you feel the Fed may be a little bit behind on inflation, whether in the recent disinflation we're seeing is transitory or not, and how this affects the idea of a soft landing if you're projecting just 0.5% growth for this year.
So if I think I got your question. So
ما عارف السؤال شو هو.
One thing is to say is I think our policies in getting into a pretty good place now. We're restrictive, and I think we're getting close to that level of sufficient. We think sufficiently restrictive. We laid out today what our best estimates are to get there. And it boils down to how long we think this process is going to take. We welcome these better inflation reports for the last 2 months. They're very welcome, but I think we're realistic about the broader project. So
هلا الأرقام عم تشوف تحسن بس بعد بدنا شغل.
We see goods prices coming down. We understand what will happen with housing services, but the big story will really be the rest of it, and there's not much progress there, and that's going to take some time. I think
بدها وقت. القصة بدها وقت للباقي.
We'll have to hold policy at a restrictive level.
يعني الخبرية يعني عندنا كذا شهر بعد من الزيادات. قديه؟ ما حدا بعرف
Two
صراحة.
good monthly reports are, very welcome. Of course, they're very welcome, but I think we need to be honest with ourselves that there's, inflation. 12-month core inflation is 6% CPI. That's 3 times our 2% target.
يعني بعد الكور انفليشن تبعهم اللي هو بيراقبوا اكثر. الكور انفليشن او في ارقام 2 تضخم. الكور انفليشن بقيم النفط وبعض الامور بعده كتير عالي. هو 6.6% اللي هو 3 مرات زياده عن هو التوقع اللي بده يكون 2%.
To the extent we need to keep rates higher and keep them there for longer and inflation,
بده يترك الارقام عاليه وبده يتركها على وقت اطول ليقدر يسيطر.
Readings, if they persist in time, could certainly make it more possible. So I don't think anyone knows
ما بيعرف 100%
recession or not, and if we do, whether it's going to be a deep one or not. It's not.
ما حدا بيعرف 100% اذا رح نفوت بركود اقتصادي واذا فتنا اذا رح يكون ركود عميق ولا لا. بس ولكن يعني اول مره يبلش يعترف انه الركود صار واقع تقريبا.
هالشيء a return to price stability that involves significantly less of an increase in unemployment than would be expected given the historical record.
Ryan.
Hi, Chairman Powell. Brian Chung, NBC News. You warned Americans of pain earlier this year as the Fed hikes rates, but with the Fed now expected to raise rates higher than you thought when you first said that, just wondering where we are in that pain. How would you describe that to Americans if the projections on unemployment find themselves? That would be 1.6 million Americans out of jobs.
إذا توقعات البطالة مثل ما هي يمكن نشوف 1.6 مليون أمريكي بلا وظيفة.
Raise rates high enough and from us allowing inflation to become entrenched in the economy so that the ultimate cost of getting it out of the economy would be very high in terms of unemployment, meaning very high unemployment for extended periods of time. The kind of thing that had to happen when inflation really got out of control and the Fed didn't respond aggressively enough or soon enough in a prior episode, 50 years ago.
عم بيقول البطالة عادة بدها تزيد وقت من فترة وقت فتنا بركود اقتصادي أو التضخم من 50 سنة تقريبا طلع بشكل جنوني واضطر الفيدرالي يتدخل. البطالة زادت بشكل كبير.
I wish there were a completely painless way
بتمنى يكون في امور ما اقدر اعملها بلا ما ناثر بهالطريقه، بس هاي الطريقه الوحيده. زياده الفوائد والبطاله هي اللي رح تساهم بهبوط التضخم.
We're certainly highly committed to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Grady Trimble with Fox Business. You've reiterated today, and the committee has reiterated its commitment to that 2% inflation target. I wonder, is there ever a point where you actually reevaluate that target and maybe increase your inflation target if it is stickier than even you think it is?
That's just so changing our inflation goal is just something we're not thinking about. It's not something we're not going to think about. We have a 2% inflation goal.
هدفه 2%.
Use our tools to get inflation.
رح نوصل لهلا ما عم غير الرقم.
Project at some point. But that is not where we are at all. The committee, we're not considering that. We're not going to consider that.
ما رح نقرر نغير الرقم بحال وقت قريب.
Use our tools to get inflation back to 2%.
Nicole.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. Nicole Goodkind, CNN Business. As you monitor wage growth and unemployment data, I wonder if you're paying close attention to a sector or even income level. Like, how do you factor potential exacerbations of inequality into your risk calculations, especially given the K-shaped recovery of 2020?
So I would go back to the labor market that we had in 2000.
عم يحكوا أكثر عن أسواق البطالة هلا وتأثيرها، لأنه رح تأثر على القرارات صراحة. قلنا إيه وقلنا لا، هيك بتأثر على القرارات إذا بلشت البطالة تزيد.
The gaps between racial groups and gender groups were at their smallest in recorded history. All of that because of a tight labor market. A tight labor market which
لكم عشي بدي فرجيكم اياه، بدي شارككم اياه. شفت تويت لحدا حي.
At its potential. So that seems like something that would be.
إذا بتلاحظوا هون بهيدا تويت لشخص اسمه راين ديتريك، عم بفرجي كيف الأخضر هون بهالصورة. الأخضر هو زيادة الفوائد نسبة للتضخم. لاحظوا هون مثلا بال 1981 وقت على التضخم كتير اضطروا يزيدوا الفوائد مرتين على التضخم، بس لأنه تأخروا كتير يجاوبوا قبل ما يبلش يلجموا. يعني بدكم تتوقعوا زيادة الفوائد دائما وقت يكون في تضخم قوي ليلجموا التضخم، يزيدوا الفوائد أكثر من التضخم. لذلك عم لكم بدهم يوصل لمرحلة، يعني أنا برأيي 5% يمكن ما نوقف عندها. كثير عالم فاكرين 5، يمكن نوصل ل 6% و7%. ما فينا لكم 100% وين بدنا نوصل، بس تاريخيا هذا اللي بيصير. لاحظوا هون مثلا بال 2018 وقت كان في تضخم 2.5 زادوا عن أكثر من نسبة زيادة الفوائد كانت أعلى من نسبة التضخم. هي أوضاع الركود الاقتصاد وقت يكون في تضخم عالي وزيادة الفوائد تبع الفيدرالية، هيك بيتصرفوا.
We do, yes, we absolutely do. We look at it's our regular practice to talk about unemployment rates by different.
دايما بيحكوا عن البطالة جزء من الحديث تبعهم.
And that sort of thing. We do.
هيك عم بيقول.
Keep our eye on that.
Hi, Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. What would you do if the economy slows so much that we enter a recession before we see strong, consistent signs that inflation is slowing? In other words, stagflation.
شو برأيكم إذا وصلنا لمراحل اقتصاد تأثر بشكل كتير كبير وبعد ما وصل التضخم للأرقام اللي أنت بدك إياها، شو بدك تعمل؟ هلا صعب كتير أقدر أجاوب على شيء منه مؤكد.
I've made it clear that right now the labor market's very strong. You're at near a 50-year low. You're at or above.
صعب كتير أقدر أجاوبكم على شيء منه مؤكد.
Vacancies are very high. Nominal wages are very high. So the labor market is very strong. Where we're missing is on the inflation side.
الشيء البطالة أو الأسواق الاقتصاد قوية، ما في غير التضخم المالي هو السلبي. والهدف الأساسي هلا نلجم التضخم، بس ما فيني أقول لك إذا صار هيك وإذا صار هيك كيف بدنا نتصرف. على كل حسب ما يصير أي موضوع بنتصرف على أساسه.
Getting inflation down.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. Greg Robb from Market Watch. You spoke a little bit ago. You said that the U.S. it looks like we have a structural labor shortage in the economy. Could you expand on that? Talk a little bit more
في
about
عند
that.
الامريكا
And
حكى انه في عند
talking about,
الامريكا نقص باليد
given
العامله.
Congress
فيك تحكي
action
اكثر عن
on,
هالموضوع؟ هيك عم يسأله.
increasing like legal immigration, things like that. Thank you.
So what I meant by that with structural labor shortage is if you look at where we are now, as I mentioned, if you just look at demand for labor, you can look at vacancies plus people who are actually working, and then you can take
طلب على اليد العامله مقابل الوظائف المعروضه بالسوق.
And you're more than 4 million people short.
انت ما في نقص بالوظائف بقيمه تقريبا 4 مليون شخص ناطرين.
Very high wages and an incredibly tight labor market, we don't see participation moving up, which is contrary to what we thought. So the upshot of all that is the labor market is actually it's 3.5 million people at least smaller than it should have been based on pre-pandemic just
عم بيقول الوظائف
our labor force should be 3.5 million more than it is, and that it can there are lots of easy ways to get to bigger numbers than that if you go back a few more years. So why is that? Part of it is just accelerated retirements. People dropped out and aren't coming back at a higher rate.
احد الاسباب هالامور لان العالم في طلب كتير على الوظائف وما عم بيتم.
And part of it is that migration has been lower. We don't prescribe, it's not our job.
هو بيقول انه بعد الكورونا كتير عالم ما عملوا تقاعد بكير. كتير من العالم ما عادوا رجعوا على الشغل بعد الكورونا. هالشيء ساهم بزياده الطلب. يعني في عدد في قله من العالم عم تشتغل حاليا وفي طلب كبير وهالشيء عم يعطيهم دفع ليقدروا يكفوا بزياده الفوائد. شكله في صعود خفيف للبيتكوين هلا. ان شاء الله يكمل.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance.
ارتداد خفيف.
You say you expect growth of just 0.5% next year. Given that you've said the process of raising rates and getting inflation back under control will be painful, have you had discussions within the committee and addressed how long and or how deep of a recession you would be willing to accept?
هل حكيتوا انه اذا وقت نفوت بالركود الاقتصادي قد ايه انت قبلان تفوت اي درجه بالركود الاقتصادي العميق او غير عميق هالامور؟
For slow growth, for a softening labor market, by which I mean unemployment goes up but not.
المباراة بعدها 1-0 المباراة.
And you see inflation coming down. You see rates going up a lot. You see inflation coming down. Those are those forecasts, and that's really what they show. We're not. We all, of course, we don't talk about this kind of a recession and that kind of a recession. We make those forecasts. The staff runs, and you will see this if you look at the old Teal books, runs alternative simulations of all different kinds at every meeting, and we look at those too. And those will explore different things. But that's just upside and downside scenarios. Of course, that's responsible practice that we've carried on for many decades. But no, we don't. We haven't asked ourselves that question.
We'll go to Jean for the last question.
Hi, Jean Young with Market News. I wanted to ask about the SEP again. If you are reaching peak rates around 5% in the first half of next year and inflation starts to decline materially, that would seem to make the real rate gradually more restrictive. Is that something that's built into the projections and into models? Is that something you would want to see?
So we do know that, of course, that's something that we know and we'd see. But as I mentioned, we wouldn't.
عم يسألوا عن زيادة الفوائد. إذا بلشت تشوف هبوط، هل معقول تفكر توقف أو تعمل شيء بالفوائد؟ هل الأشياء بتطلعوا عليها؟ أكيد بنطلع عليها.
I don't see us as having a really clear and precise understanding of what the neutral rate is and what real rates are.
ما بيعرف بس واحد لأي درجة هالمعطيات بده ينطرها ويشوف.
For cutting rates, I think in the event it'll be a question of do we actually feel confident that inflation is coming down in a sustained way. Thank you very much.
خلص المؤتمر الصحفي. لا هذا هو المؤتمر. ضروري تعرفوا انه بالملخص رح يضلوا زياده الفوائد ما رح توقف، مثل ما بتفرجيكم هون دايما وقت يكون في تضخم عالي الدولة بتتدخل بأمريكا تاريخيا يعني الفيدرالي بيتدخل بيزيد الفوائد بيعلي الفايدة فوق نسبة التضخم. لذلك حاليا بعد التضخم النسبة له كتير عالي 7.1 رقم كتير عالي يعني بده يقرب عليه. أنا عم لكم لذلك على المرجح يكفي زيادة إلا إذا صار شيء انكسر شيء بالاقتصاد فتنا بركود عميق ساعتها بده يعمل تحول بسياسته ويبلشوا يطبقوا مصاري عن جديد وبيغيروا القانون تبع التضخم. عادة هيك بيصير دايما وبيصير شيء من هالنوع. ولكن حاليا كل المؤشرات بتفرجينا رح يكفوا زيادة فوائد رح يكفوا زيادة فوائد يعني السنة اللي جاية رح نشوف في ركود اقتصادي. هلا يمكن يصير في مثل ما يعرف بكريسماس بامب بامريكا بفتره الاعياد بيصير صعود شوي بالاسواق التقليديه ولكن حضروا حالكم في خطوره كتير انه نرجع نهبط. هل في امل نكفي صعود؟ اكيد اذا صار شيء غير وتغيير مهم بالاسواق العالميه. ولكن ضلكم احموا حالكم انتم خذوا قراراتكم اعملوا دراستكم الخاصه. اكيد انا ما عم بعطيكم نصائح استثماريه ولكن السياسة الحالية ما في شيء متغير فيها. يمكن يخفف قساوة الزيادات تبطل 0.75% يبلش 0.50 و0.5 و0.25 يمكن ولكن بعده عم بيزيد الفوائد يعني بعده في سياسة تشدد بالأسواق. هذا كل شيء انا بدي اقول لكم اياه. ان شاء الله انبسطتوا بالفيديو. اذا انبسطتوا اعملوا لايك اعملوا سبسكرايب للشانل وانا بشوفكم قريبا بفيديو جديد وماركت اب جديد.